It was late spring in the high plains of New Mexico when sudden rainstorms sweep across the desert without warning. Inside a battered shed on the outskirts of Gallup, a farmer named Earl Whitman hurried to get some equipment under cover before the downpour soaked everything. That day, Earl had a visitor. Mark Hanley, a young drifter he'd known for years, had dropped by. Earl would later recall the moment with a shrug. "He's a friend of mine," he told investigators. "You don't just turn your back on friends." The police didn't realize it yet, but Earl was showing them the very place where their case would take a shocking turn. To the outside world, Earl Whitman was a plain man. He lived alone on a stretch of desert land that most people in town avoided. The soil was dry, the wind constant, and the old barn sat like a relic of another time. But investigators weren't interested in his crops. They were interested in the company he kept. Mark Hanley wasn't just a passing visitor. He had been spending more time at the Whitman property in recent months. Locals whispered that Earl looked after him like family. But others noticed Mark's erratic behavior. The way he'd vanish for days and return looking thinner, jittery, always with secrets he wouldn't share. That day, standing in Earl's barn, officers began to realize they were standing on ground that held more than just tools and hay. The barn was dark, its corners layered in dust and old cobwebs. Rain tapped against the roof, adding a steady rhythm to silence. Earl pointed to a side stall where Mark had been working on repairs. The boards were newly nailed. They were far too fresh compared to the rest of the barn's weather planks. "Right there," Earl muttered. The detectives exchanged glances. Something wasn't right. The smell of damp earth and oil couldn't hide the sharp metallic tang that crept into their noses. And just like that, what started as a casual walk through a farmer's barn shifted into the opening act of a criminal investigation that would shake the quiet New Mexico desert. Mark Hanley wasn't from Gallup. He had drifted in from Flagstaff, Arizona, a man without roots, a man without a past that anyone could fully trace. To some, he was charming in that restless way, always ready with a grin, always with stories about places no one else had been. To others, he was a storm waiting to break. At first, his presence on Earl Whitman's land raised no alarms. Farmers helped each other out here. A spare bed in the loft, a warm meal at the table, a chance to work the soil. That was tradition, but this was different. Mark wasn't here to build a life. He was here to hide from one. Neighbors began to whisper. Why did Mark spend so much time sealed inside the barn? Why did Earl, a man who had lived in Gallup his whole life, suddenly look over his shoulder whenever strangers drove down the dirt road? The storm outside that day mirrored the one quietly brewing inside the walls of that old barn. And soon, law enforcement would realize just how much danger had been allowed to grow in plain sight. Detectives moved closer to the stall Earl had pointed out. Every creak of the wood under their boots seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the cavernous space. The newer boards nailed across the stall didn't match the rest of the barn. They gleamed pale against the dark, weathered oak, almost as if they were trying too hard to cover something up. An officer ran his hand across the planks. They were solid, but the nails had been driven in crooked, as if hammered in haste. He crouched, pressed his ear to the wood, and tapped. The hollow sound that came back made the hairs on everyone's arms stand up. Earl Whitman shifted uneasily. He hadn't said much, just kept repeating that he was only helping a friend, but his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, the barn, silent for years, was suddenly speaking louder than anyone in the room. The decision was made. Officers pried the boards loose, one by one. The sound of splintering would fill the barn, each crack tearing away at the thin veil that had kept the secret hidden. Behind the boards was not just empty space. It was a crude enclosure, lined with plastic sheeting, the kind used to keep moisture out. Inside, the stench hit them first. A sickening blend of decay and chemicals that told the officers they weren't just uncovering tools or stolen goods. What they found would change the course of the investigation. Inside that enclosure lay evidence of a crime so disturbing it could no longer be ignored. The mystery of Mark Hanley's presence on the Whitman farm was unraveling, and with it, the quiet illusion of safety in this forgotten corner of the New Mexico desert. The barn was no longer just a barn. It was now a crime scene. As officers cataloged the contents of the hidden enclosure, the barn grew quieter. The storm outside reduced to a faint drizzle. What they pulled out was not a single item, but a collection. Torn clothing, a rusted tool stained dark, and scraps of duct tape curled like dead snakes. Every piece told its own silent story, and together they painted a picture far darker than anyone wanted to admit. Earl Whitman sat on an overturned bucket, head in his hands, mumbling the same words over and over. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. But the evidence said otherwise. You don't just stumble onto secrets like this. Someone built that stall. Someone sealed it. Someone tried to bury the truth within it. And Mark Hanley wasn't there to answer questions. Detectives had to decide. Was Earl simply a naive farmer caught in another man's storm, or was he part of it? The deeper investigators dug, the more Mark Hanley's past began to unravel. Old records surfaced from Arizona, a string of small arrests, unpaid debts, and whispered accusations that never made it to court. Neighbors and Flagstaff remembered him differently. A mechanic, a gambler, sometimes a drifter who owed more money than he could ever repay. But one story kept repeating. People around him had a way of disappearing. A girlfriend who never came back to collect her things. A drinking buddy who left town without warning. Each absence was brushed off. Each disappearance explained away. Until now, back in Gallup, detectives spread photos of Mark, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen him. Some said yes. He'd been spotted at the edge of town, sometimes walking alone, sometimes carrying heavy bags that no one ever saw opened. The picture was clear. Mark Hanley hadn't come to Earl Whitman's land to start fresh. He had come to bury his past, and perhaps his victims, where no one would look. The desert has a way of keeping secrets. The winds cover tracks, the sun bleaches bones, and the vast emptiness swallows voices. But it also remembers. Forensic teams scoured the property. Dogs were brought in, their noses trained to find what the eye cannot see. Hours passed under the punishing New Mexico sun until one of the handlers raised his hand. The dogs had locked onto something near a shallow pit behind the barn. Shovels hit the dirt. Each scrape brought the smell closer until the earth itself seemed to breathe out the secret it had been holding. What emerged wasn't just evidence. It was a body, or rather what was left of one. Suddenly, the stall in the barn made sense. The torn clothing, the duct tape, the silence of a farmer who claimed ignorance. This wasn't just about Mark Hanley anymore. This was about life taken, hidden, and left for the desert to keep. And the desert had finally spoken. The first body was only the beginning. As the desert surrendered more of its secrets, investigators uncovered not one, but two additional shallow graves near the Whitman property line. Each site told the same story. Hurriedly dug, poorly concealed, left to the elements. It wasn't the work of someone careless. It was the work of someone desperate. Someone convinced the desert would never give up what it was asked to keep. Earl Whitman's denials grew thinner with each discovery. At first, he insisted he knew nothing, that Mark Hanley had used the barn without his knowledge. But the evidence was closing in. The fresh lumber, the plastic sheeting, the disturbed soil, all of it was on Earl's land. When detectives pressed him, Earl's voice cracked. I thought I was helping him, he whispered. Helping him hide tools, or helping him hide bodies? The line between ignorance and complicity was disappearing fast. At the Gallup Sheriff's Office, Earl Whitman sat under the glare of a single lamp, hands folded tight, his weathered face shadowed by exhaustion. Across from him, two detectives leaned forward. Earl, one of them said slowly, you need to understand these aren't just secrets in your barn. These are lives. For hours, Earl's story shifted like desert sand. First, he was the innocent farmer. Then, he admitted Mark had asked for a favor or two. Finally, under the weight of evidence, he revealed fragments of the truth. Mark had shown up months earlier, restless and frantic. He'd begged Earl for a place to stay, promising it was only temporary. Then came the lumber, the plastic sheeting, the night spent hammering in the barn. Earl claimed he never asked questions, never wanted to know. But one question hung in the air. If Earl was truly innocent, why hadn't he spoken up sooner? Silence stretched, heavy as the storm clouds that had first brought detectives to his farm. The final confrontation came not in the barn, but in the sterile quiet of a courtroom. By then, forensic evidence had painted its story. DNA from the graves matched missing persons from Arizona and New Mexico. The duct tape carried fingerprints. The rusted tool carried blood. And while Mark Hanley had vanished into thin air, the man left to answer for it all was Earl Whitman. Prosecutors painted him as an accomplice, a man who sheltered a killer and allowed his land to become a graveyard. The defense argued he was a victim of manipulation, a simple farmer caught in the orbit of a dangerous drifter. The jury listened, stone-faced, and when the verdict came, it echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Guilty. Earl Whitman's shoulders sagged, his weathered hands trembling as deputies led him away. The desert outside remained unchanged, vast, quiet, eternal, but its secrets were no longer buried. The barn that once held nothing more than dust and tools was now remembered as a place of horror, and the name Mark Hanley would haunt Gallup, New Mexico, long after the trials were over. The Gallup Desert is vast and timeless, its horizon stretching further than the eye can see. For centuries, it has carried the weight of silence. But silence, as this case revealed, can be dangerous. It can mask crimes. It can protect killers. And sometimes it can cost lives. The story of Earl Whitman and Mark Hanley was not just about a farmer and a drifter. It was about how secrets fester when no one dares to confront them. For years, neighbors ignored the warning signs. The strange hours, the hurried repairs in the barn, the quiet fear in Earl's eyes. Each dismissed suspicion, allowed the truth to sink deeper into the soil. The discovery of multiple graves shattered the illusion of safety in Gallup. Families who had waited for news of their missing loved ones finally received answers, but not the answers they had prayed for. Their grief turned into something heavier. The knowledge that those they had lost had been hidden in plain sight, on land that should have been harmless. In the aftermath, the case forced law enforcement across New Mexico and Arizona to rethink how they handled transient drifters and rural crime scenes. Training programs were expanded, new protocols written, and community outreach became a priority. The hope was clear. No other small town should ever overlook the subtle signs of danger the way Gallup once did. Yet, even with new safeguards, the scars remain. The barn is gone now, demolished under court order, but locals say the land still feels heavy, as if it remembers what happened there. Children are warned not to play near it. Travelers driving past whisper about the farmers' graves. The desert has reclaimed the ground, but the memory lingers like a shadow. For those who survive, one lesson endures. Evil rarely arrives as a monster in the night. More often, it comes disguised as a friend in need, a visitor seeking shelter, a man who promises he'll only stay for a little while. And in that truth lies a haunting reminder of Gallup's tragedy. Sometimes the greatest danger is not the storm outside, but the silence we allow to grow inside our homes, our barns, and our hearts.